On the morning of August 6, 1945, Major Richard Ira Bong climbed into the cockpit of a Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star at Burbank, California, and prepared for a routine test flight. At 24 years old, he was already America's greatest fighter ace, credited with 40 confirmed kills over the Pacific, more than any other American pilot in history. He'd survived 3 years of combat flying the P-38 Lightning through some of the deadliest skies of World War II. He'd been shot at by Japanese fighters, by anti-aircraft fire, by nervous Allied gunners who mistook him for the enemy. He'd walked away from mechanical failures, crash landings, and missions that killed men flying beside him. But on this August morning, flying a jet aircraft that represented the future of aviation, his luck ran out. Minutes after takeoff, the P-80's engine failed. Bong attempted to bail out, but was too low. The jet crashed into a residential neighborhood, exploding on impact. Major Richard Bong, the ace of aces, the farm boy from Wisconsin who'd become a national hero, died instantly. The timing was cruel and symbolic. That same morning, halfway around the world, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion killed tens of thousands instantly and changed warfare forever. News of Hiroshima dominated every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every conversation. Bong's death, which would have been front-page news on any other day, was buried in the back pages, a small tragedy overwhelmed by a world-changing event. His passing marked the end of an era in ways that went beyond coincidence. Bong represented a style of warfare, individual combat between pilots and prop-driven fighters, victory determined by skill and courage in aerial combat duels that the atomic bomb had just rendered obsolete. The war he'd fought with machine guns and flying skill was ending. The war that would replace it would be fought with missiles and nuclear weapons, where individual heroism mattered less than industrial capacity and technological superiority. This is the story of Richard Bong, how a quiet farm kid became America's deadliest pilot, what it cost him to survive when so many others didn't, and how his death on the war's final days captured something essential about the transformation from one kind of conflict to another. The unlikely ace. Richard Bong didn't look like a fighter pilot. He was stocky, broad-shouldered, built more like a farmhand than the lean, handsome aviators who appeared in recruiting posters. He was quiet, almost shy, uncomfortable with attention or praise. He didn't drink, didn't chase women, didn't engage in the braggadocio that characterized many fighter pilots. When reporters interviewed him after his victories mounted, they found him frustratingly humble, crediting luck, his aircraft, his wingmen, anyone but himself. He'd grown up in Poplar, Wisconsin, a small farming community where his Swedish immigrant parents raised 9 children. The family was poor, in the way rural Depression-era families were poor. Not starving, but working constantly just to stay afloat. Bong helped on the farm, attended local schools, and showed no particular aptitude for anything except mechanical work. He could fix engines, understood how machinery worked, had the patient temperament of someone who'd spent childhood repairing equipment that the family couldn't afford to replace. Aviation caught his interest in his late teens. Not from any romantic notions about flying, but from practical fascination with aircraft as machines. He enrolled in the civilian pilot training program while attending Superior State Teachers College, learning to fly in the same methodical way he'd learned to repair tractors. He was a natural pilot in the unspectacular sense. not flashy or instinctively brilliant, but careful, precise, able to make an aircraft do exactly what he wanted. When war came, Bong enlisted in the Army Air Corps. His instructors noted his exceptional gunnery scores and his unusual spatial awareness, the ability to track multiple aircraft simultaneously and predict their movements. These weren't skills that could be taught. Either you had them or you didn't. Bong had them. He received his commission and wings in May 1942 and was assigned to fighter training. The P-38 Lightning became his aircraft. A twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that was complex to fly but devastatingly effective in the hands of a skilled pilot. The P-38 had long range, heavy armament, and good high-altitude performance. It was also unforgiving. The engines could fail independently, creating control problems that killed inexperienced pilots. Bong mastered it completely. In September 1942, he shipped out to the Pacific Theater, assigned to the 49th Fighter Group based in Australia. He was 22 years old, a second lieutenant, indistinguishable from dozens of other young pilots flooding into the theater. Nothing about him suggested he would become legendary. Learning to kill. Bong's first combat missions occurred during the desperate early days of the Pacific War, when Allied forces were barely holding on. He flew patrol missions over New Guinea, escorted bombers, strafed Japanese positions. The flying was dangerous, and the enemy was skilled. Japanese pilots in their Zero fighters had years of combat experience and aircraft designed for maneuverability. The early missions were mostly about learning to stay alive. His first confirmed kill came on December 27, 1942. A Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar fighter shot down over Buna, New Guinea. The engagement lasted seconds. Bong spotted the Japanese fighter, maneuvered into position, and fired a burst that sent it spiraling into the jungle. He felt no elation, no triumph, just confirmation that his training worked, that he could do what was required. The kills accumulated steadily through 1943. Bong developed a reputation as a patient hunter who waited for perfect firing solutions rather than spraying ammunition wildly. His gunnery was exceptional. He could hit targets from angles and distances that other pilots couldn't manage. He understood deflection shooting instinctively, calculating the lead needed to hit a moving target without conscious thought. His wingmen learned to trust his judgment completely. When Bong said break, you broke immediately. What set him apart wasn't aggression or recklessness, qualities that got many aces killed, but a kind of methodical lethality. He studied his opponents, learned their tactics, identified their weaknesses. Japanese fighters were more maneuverable than the P-38, so Bong avoided turning dogfights. Instead, he used the Lightning's speed and firepower, making high-speed passes and diving away before the enemy could react. He shot down fighters the way a sniper shoots targets, efficiently, dispassionately, with minimal wasted motion. By April 1944, Bong had 28 confirmed kills, making him one of the leading American aces. His score continued climbing through the summer, 30, 32, 35 victories. Each kill was documented, witnessed, confirmed through gun camera footage or corroborating testimony. The numbers were real, not propaganda inflation. Bong was genuinely that good. But the accumulating victories came at a cost that wasn't reflected in his official record. He'd watched friends die. He'd seen aircraft explode, seen parachutes fail to open, seen men burn. He'd flown through anti-aircraft fire so thick it seemed impossible to survive. He'd returned from missions with his aircraft shot full of holes, with one engine dead, with hydraulics failing. The missions blurred together into an exhausting routine of combat, maintenance, more combat. Sleep became difficult. The constant alertness required for survival, scanning the sky continuously, processing threats, making split-second life-or-death decisions, created a mental fatigue that rest couldn't cure. In September 1944, Bong shot down his 40th aircraft, a Japanese fighter over the Philippines. The victory made him America's highest-scoring ace, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills. General MacArthur personally presented him with the Medal of Honor. The press celebrated him as a national hero. His hometown threw parades. His picture appeared in newspapers and magazines across the country. And General MacArthur, recognizing that Bong had become too valuable as a symbol to risk in further combat, ordered him home. The weight of survival. Bong didn't want to leave. Combat had become his purpose, the thing he was good at, the place where his particular skills had meaning. Returning to the United States meant becoming a symbol, a propaganda tool, a celebrity. All roles that made him deeply uncomfortable. But orders were orders. In December 1944, he returned stateside, his combat career over at age 24. The homecoming was overwhelming. He was assigned to public relations duties, bond tours, speeches, appearances at war plants. Everywhere he went, crowds wanted to see America's greatest ace, to hear about aerial combat, to touch someone who'd survived when so many hadn't. Bong endured it with the same quiet patience he'd shown in combat, doing what was asked of him because it was his duty. But the adjustment was difficult. Men who'd survived extended combat often struggled with returning to normal life. The constant alertness required for survival didn't turn off just because you were safe. Bong found himself scanning the sky reflexively, tensing at sudden noises, unable to fully relax. The skills that had kept him alive, the hypervigilance, the instant threat assessment, the readiness to kill, had no place in civilian society, but couldn't be easily abandoned. In February 1945, he married Marjorie Vattendahl, his longtime sweetheart for whom he'd named his P-38 Marge. The marriage was happy. Marge understood him, accepted his quietness, didn't demand that he be someone he wasn't. They settled in California, where Bong had been assigned as a test pilot for the Air Force's emerging jet program. The assignment made sense. Bong was an exceptional pilot with extensive combat experience. His technical understanding of aircraft made him valuable for evaluating new designs. And jet aircraft represented the future. The Air Force needed combat veterans to help transition from propeller fighters to jets. The P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, required testing by pilots who understood what combat aircraft needed to do. But test flying was dangerous in different ways than combat. Combat flying meant operating proven aircraft in extreme circumstances. Test flying meant operating unproven aircraft in circumstances that might reveal fatal flaws. The P-80 was cutting-edge technology, powered by a centrifugal flow turbojet engine that was temperamental and prone to failure. Several test pilots had already died in P-80 crashes. The aircraft was faster than anything Bong had flown, over 550 miles per hour in level flight. But that speed came with risks that weren't fully understood. Bong approached test flying with the same methodical care he'd brought to combat. He studied the aircraft's systems, learned its characteristics, flew conservatively while building up experience. He'd logged only about 15 hours in the P-80 by early August 1945, enough to be familiar with the aircraft, not enough to have encountered all its potential problems. Real quick, please like and subscribe to help our channel grow. Now back to the story. August 6th, 1945. The morning of August 6th was routine. Bong arrived at Lockheed Air Terminal in Burbank for a scheduled test flight. The P-80 he'd be flying was a production model, not an experimental prototype, but an aircraft that had completed factory testing and was being evaluated for operational characteristics. The flight plan was simple. Takeoff, climb to altitude, run through basic maneuvers, land. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. Bong completed his pre-flight inspection and climbed into the cockpit. The P-80's cockpit was more cramped than the P-38's, with the pilot seated in a bubble canopy that provided excellent visibility. The jet engine, mounted in the fuselage behind the cockpit, was audible as a high-pitched whine rather than the throaty roar of piston engines. Everything about flying jets felt different. The acceleration was smoother, the controls lighter, the speed almost surreal. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Bong received clearance and began his takeoff roll. The P-80 accelerated quickly, reaching takeoff speed in seconds. Eyewitnesses on the ground watched the jet lift off and begin climbing normally. Then, at about 500 feet altitude, something went wrong. The exact sequence of events remains disputed. Most accounts indicate the engine failed, either flaming out completely or losing power suddenly. Without thrust, the P-80 became a glider with poor gliding characteristics. Bong attempted to turn back toward the airfield, but quickly realized he didn't have enough altitude or airspeed to make it. His only option was to bail out. The P-80 was equipped with a standard seatbelt and shoulder harness, no ejection seat, which wouldn't become common for several more years. Bailing out required manually opening the canopy, releasing the restraints, and jumping clear of the aircraft. At low altitude and low airspeed, this sequence had to happen in seconds. Bong jettisoned the canopy and apparently attempted to bail out. But the aircraft was too low, the sequence took too long, or something prevented him from clearing the cockpit. The P-80 nosed over and plunged into a residential area near the intersection of Oxnard Street and Satsuma Avenue in North Hollywood. The crash destroyed the aircraft and set several structures on fire. Bong died on impact, killed instantly by the crash or the resulting explosion. Emergency responders reached the crash site within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. The wreckage was scattered across several properties. Fuel fires burned until fire crews could extinguish them. Witnesses described seeing the pilot attempt to bail out but never clearing the aircraft. Whether he was trapped by equipment, injured in the initial malfunction, or simply ran out of time, nobody could say for certain. The official accident investigation concluded that the engine failure resulted from a faulty fuel pump. A mechanical failure, not pilot error. The P-80 program had experienced multiple crashes related to engine reliability. Bong's death was preventable in the sense that better quality control might have caught the faulty component. But it wasn't the result of anything he did wrong. He'd flown correctly, responded appropriately to the emergency, and simply run out of altitude before he could escape. The day the world changed. On any other day, Major Richard Bong's death would have dominated American news. the nation's highest-scoring ace, killed in a test flight accident just months after returning from combat. It was the kind of story that newspapers would have run on the front page, that radio networks would have interrupted programming to announce. Bong was famous, beloved, a genuine American hero. His death was news. But August 6th, 1945, wasn't any other day. That morning, a single B-29 bomber had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The explosion instantly killed an estimated 70,000 people and would eventually kill perhaps 140,000 from immediate effects and radiation. The news stunned the world. Nothing like this had ever happened. The atomic bomb represented a weapon so powerful that it challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, politics, and human civilization. American newspapers that day led with Hiroshima. The atomic bomb filled the front pages, pushed every other story aside, dominated radio broadcasts. President Truman's announcement, the War Department's statements, speculation about Japan's response, discussion of what this new weapon meant. These were the stories that mattered on August 6th. Bong's death was mentioned, but briefly, often in small notices buried on interior pages. Some newspapers ran it the next day, after the immediate shock of Hiroshima had passed slightly. But even then, the coverage was muted, overshadowed by continuing atomic bomb news and Japan's response. The timing robbed Bong of the public a mourning his service deserved. He'd survived 3 years of combat, only to die in a training accident on the day the world changed. The irony was painful and profound. Bong represented a kind of warfare, individual skill, aerial duels, victory through courage and capability, that the atomic bomb had just rendered obsolete. Fighter aces meant something when wars were won through accumulated small victories, when individual pilots could change outcomes through exceptional skill. But in an age of atomic weapons, individual heroism mattered less. Strategic bombing with nuclear weapons made the fighter pilot's art less relevant. The war Bong had fought was ending. The war that would replace it had no place for aces. His funeral, held in his hometown of Poplar, Wisconsin, was a quiet affair attended by family, friends, and a few military representatives. The crowds that might have gathered on another day were absent. The nation was focused on Hiroshima and the coming end of the war. Bong was buried in the local cemetery, his grave marked with a simple military headstone. His widow, Marge, was pregnant with their first child, a son Bong would never meet. The ace who didn't want fame. In the years after his death, Richard Bong was gradually rediscovered and properly honored. The Air Force named its training base in Wisconsin after him. Airports, schools, bridges, and memorials bear his name. His P-38 Marge is displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. His story appears in books and documentaries about World War II aviation. He's remembered as America's greatest ace, the quiet farm boy who became a lethal fighter pilot. But the memorials and honors miss something essential about who Bong actually was. He didn't seek glory or fame. He wasn't trying to become an ace or set records. He was doing a job, a dangerous job that he happened to be exceptionally good at. And he did it with the same unpretentious competence he'd brought to farm work in Wisconsin. The kills accumulated not because he was hunting glory, but because he was surviving. And survival in aerial combat meant killing the enemy before they killed you. His 40 confirmed victories represented 40 times he'd seen a Japanese pilot, probably a young man not much different from himself, and ended that man's life. He didn't agonize over this publicly, but people who knew him well noted that he never gloried in killing. He was matter-of-fact about it, the way soldiers often are when discussing the ugly necessities of war. The alternative to shooting down enemy aircraft was dying himself, or watching his wingmen die, or letting bombers be destroyed. So he shot down enemy aircraft, and he was very good at it, and he felt the weight of it in ways the press never captured. His Medal of Honor citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, and noted that his fearless and aggressive flying had destroyed 40 enemy aircraft. These words were accurate, but somehow missed the point. Bong wasn't fearless. He felt fear, managed it, flew anyway. He wasn't aggressive in the traditional sense. He was patient, methodical, choosing his moments carefully. His success came not from recklessness, but from its opposite. From cold calculation, perfect execution, and the ability to make life-or-death decisions in fractions of seconds. What made him exceptional wasn't just his skill, though that was extraordinary. It was his ability to survive 3 years of combat in the Pacific Theater, a period when most fighter pilots were killed, injured, or rotated home after shorter tours. He flew 200 combat missions, survived countless close calls, watched squadrons rotate through replacement pilots as casualties mounted. The mental toughness required to keep flying effective combat missions despite seeing friends die, despite understanding that statistically you should be dead already, despite accumulating fatigue that made every mission harder. That kind of endurance was rarer than pure flying skill. Legacy in contrails and silence. The P-80 shooting star that killed Richard Bong went into service shortly after his death. It was eventually replaced by more advanced jets, but it served as a bridge between propeller fighters and the jet age that would follow. Dozens of pilots flew P-80s successfully. The mechanical issues that caused Bong's crash were identified and corrected. The aircraft itself wasn't fundamentally flawed. It was just new, pushing technology that wasn't yet fully reliable, operated by pilots learning to fly in ways their training hadn't fully prepared them for. Bong's death highlighted the dangers of test flying, which killed far more pilots in the post-war years than combat had during the war. Jets were faster, more complex, and less forgiving than the aircraft they replaced. The transition from props to jets created new failure modes that weren't understood until pilots encountered them. Sometimes fatally. The men who flew these tests were pioneers, exploring the edge of what was possible, and the edge was dangerous. For Marge Bong, widowed at 23 and pregnant with a child her husband would never see, the loss was profound and permanent. She eventually remarried and lived a long life. But she never stopped honoring Dick's memory. In interviews years later, she described him as humble, kind, uncomfortable with his fame. A man who'd done extraordinary things, but remained fundamentally ordinary in the best sense of that word. The 40 aircraft Bong shot down represented 40 small victories in a war that was ultimately won through industrial production, logistics, and strategic bombing. No single fighter pilot, no matter how skilled, could change the outcome of World War II. The war was too big, involved too many people, depended on factors far beyond individual combat prowess. But within his sphere, the skies over New Guinea and the Philippines, the bomber escorts he protected, the enemy fighters he destroyed, Bong made a difference that was real and measurable. His combat career lasted about 30 months. In that time, he flew 200 missions, achieved 40 confirmed kills, earned the Medal of Honor, and became America's greatest ace. Then he came home, married the woman he loved, took a job that seemed safer than combat, and died in a training accident on the day the atomic bomb announced that the kind of war he'd fought was ending. The timing wasn't poetic or meaningful. It was random, the kind of coincidence that occurs when enough events happen simultaneously. But it captured something true about the transition between eras. August 6, 1945, marked the end of one kind of warfare and the beginning of another. Richard Bong, who'd epitomized individual martial skill in an age of mechanized combat, died as that age ended. It wasn't symbolic, it was just sad. The loss of a young man whose skills had proven exceptional, but whose luck, in the end, proved merely human. The quiet hero. What remains is the image of a stocky kid from Wisconsin who became the deadliest American fighter pilot in history, then died testing a jet on a sunny August afternoon. He didn't seek the role. He didn't enjoy the fame it brought. He just flew, shot straight, survived when others didn't, and accumulated a record that stands unmatched more than 80 years later. No American pilot has surpassed Bong's 40 victories. No one has come close. Wars changed. Tactics evolved. Air combat became about missiles and electronics rather than guns and eyesight. The conditions that created aces, extended combat deployments, frequent engagements, enemy aircraft in sufficient numbers, haven't existed in the same way since World War II. Bong's record will likely stand forever, not because future pilots lack skill, but because warfare changed into something that doesn't produce aces the way the Pacific War did. He would have found that fact unremarkable. Bong didn't care about records or comparisons. He cared about doing his job, protecting his wingmen, and surviving to see Marge again. That he became legendary was almost incidental to his actual concerns. The legend was something that happened to him, not something he pursued. On August 6, 1945, as the world reeled from news of Hiroshima and contemplated what atomic weapons meant for humanity's future, America's greatest ace died quietly in a California suburb. His death was a footnote to bigger events, a small tragedy overwhelmed by global transformation. But for the people who knew him, who'd flown with him, who trusted him to keep them alive, and for his widow, waiting at home for a husband who would never return, the loss was personal and complete. Richard Bong was 24 years old when he died. He'd lived long enough to become extraordinary, but not long enough to become old. His last flight ended not in aerial combat, where his skills could have made a difference, but in a mechanical failure that gave him no chance to fight back. He deserved better. But war and flying don't distribute outcomes based on what people deserve. Sometimes you survive 40 combat missions and die in training. Sometimes you become America's greatest ace and nobody notices because the world is busy learning about atomic bombs. That's a story, not the heroic narrative the press wanted, not the legend that developed afterward, but the actual truth. A quiet man from Wisconsin who flew better than anyone else, survived longer than most, and died on the same day the kind of war he'd fought came to an end. He was America's ace of aces. And on August 6, 1945, while the world watched Hiroshima burn, he flew his last flight into California sunshine and didn't come back. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.